Chapter 29. I still loved, at any rate practiced, music. I had the big Pleyel harpsichord I use here in our Paris flat. One warm day in spring, it would have been in 1920, I was playing by chance with the windows open when the bell rang. The maid came in to say that a gentleman had called and wished to speak to me. In fact, the gentleman was already behind the maid. He corrected her. He wanted to listen to me, not speak to me. He was such an extraordinary-looking man that I hardly noticed the extraordinariness of the intrusion. About 60, extremely tall, faultlessly dressed, a gardenia in his buttonhole. I looked sharply at Conchis. He had turned and, as he seemed to like to, was looking out to sea as he spoke. Lily swiftly, discreetly, raised her finger to her lips. And also, at first sight, excessively morose. There was beneath the archducal dignity something deeply mournful about him, like the actor Jouvet, but without his sarcasm. Later I was to discover that he was less miserable than he appeared. Almost without words he sat down in an armchair and listened to me play. And when I had finished, almost without words, he picked up his hat and his amber-topped stick. I grinned. Lily saw my grin, but looked down and refused to share it, as if to ban it, and presented me with his card and asked me to call on him the next week. The card told me that his name was Alphonse de Ducamp. He was a count. I duly presented myself at his apartment. It was very large, furnished with the severest elegance. A manservant showed me into a salon. De Ducamp rose to greet me. At once he took me, with the minimum of words, through to another room. And there were 5 or 6 harpsichords, old ones, splendid ones, all museum pieces, both as musical instruments and decorative objects. He invited me to try them all, and then he played himself, not as well as I could then, but very passably. Later he offered me a collation, and we sat on boulard chairs, gravely swallowing Marin and drinking a Moselle that he told me came from his own vineyard. So began the most remarkable friendship of my life. I learned very little about him for many months, although I saw him often. This was because he had never anything to say about himself or his past, and discouraged every kind of question. All that I could find out was that his family came from Belgium, that he was immensely rich, that he appeared from choice to have very few friends, no relations, and that he was, without being a homosexual, a misogynist. All his servants were men, and he never referred to women except with distaste. De Ducamp's real life was lived not in Paris, but at his great chateau in eastern France. It was built by some peculating superintendent in the late 17th century, and set in a park far larger than this island. One saw the slate-blue turrets and white walls from many miles away, and I remember on my first visit, some months after our first meeting, I was very intimidated. It was an October day. All the cornfields of the Champagne had long been cut. A bluish mist over everything, and autumn smoke. I arrived at Givray-le-Duc in the car that had been sent to fetch me. I was taken up a splendid staircase to my room, or rather my suite of rooms, and then I was invited to go out into the park to meet de Ducamp. All his servants were like himself, silent, grave-looking men. There was never laughter around him, or running feet, no noise, no excitement, but calm and order. I followed the servant through a huge formal garden behind the chateau, past box hedges and statuary, and over freshly raked gravel, and then down through an arboretum to a small lake. We came out at its edge, and on a small point some 100 yards ahead, I saw, over the still water and through the October leaves, an oriental tea-house. The servant bowed and left me to go on my way alone. The path led beside the lake over a small stream. There was no wind, mist, silence, a beautiful but rather melancholy calm. The tea-house was approached over grass, so Desducans could not hear me coming. He was seated on a mat staring out over the lake, a willow-covered islet, ornamental geese that floated on the water as in a silk painting. Though his head was European, his clothes were Japanese. I shall never forget that moment. How shall I say it? That mise en passage. His whole park was arranged to provide him with such decors, such ambiances. There was a little classical temple, a rotunda, an English garden, a Moorish one, but I always think of him sitting there on his tatami in a loose kimono, grayish-blue, the color of the mist. It was unnatural, of course, but all dandyism and eccentricity is more or less unnatural in a world dominated by the desperate struggle for economic survival. Constantly, during that first visit, I was shocked as a would-be socialist, and ravished as an homme sensuel. Givray-le-Duc was nothing more nor less than a vast museum. There were countless galleries of paintings, of porcelain, of objets d'art of all kinds, a famous library, a really unsurpassed collection of early keyboard instruments, clavichords, spinets, virginals, lutes, guitars. One never knew what one would find. A room of Renaissance bronzes, a case of Breguets, a wall of magnificent Rouen and Nevers faience, an armory, a cabinet of Greek and Roman coins. I could inventory all night, for he had devoted all his life to this collecting of collections. The Boule and Rissenet alone were enough to furnish 6 smaller chateaux. I suppose only the Hertford collection would have rivaled it in modern times. Indeed, where the Hertford was split up, Desducans had bought many of the best pieces in the Sackville legacy. Seligman's gave him first choice. He collected in order to collect, of course. Art had not then become a branch of the stock market. On a later visit, he took me to a locked gallery. In it, he kept his company of automata, puppets, some almost human in size, that seemed to have stepped or whirred out of a Hoffman story. A man who conducted an invisible orchestra, 2 soldiers who fought a duel, a prima donna from whose mouth tinkled an aria from La Serve Padrona, a girl who curtsied to a man who bowed, and then danced a pallid and ghostly minuet with him. But the chief piece was Mirabelle, La Maîtresse Machine, a naked woman, painted and silk-skinned, who, when set in motion, lay back in her faded 4-poster bed, drew up her knees, and then opened them together with her arms. As her human master lay on top of her, the arms closed and held him. But Desducans cherished her most, because she had a device that made it unlikely that she would ever cuckold her owner. Unless one moved a small lever at the back of her head at a certain pressure, her arms would clasp with vice-like strength, and then a stiletto on a strong spring struck upwards through the adulterer's groin. This repulsive thing had been made in Italy in the early 19th century for the Sultan of Turkey. When Desducans demonstrated her fidelity, he turned and said, "Ce qui en elle est le plus vraisemblable." It is the most lifelike thing about her. I looked at Lily covertly. She was staring down at her hands. He kept Madame Mirabelle behind locked doors. But in his private chapel he kept an even more, to my mind, obscene object. It was encased in a magnificent early medieval reliquary. It looked much like a withered sea cucumber. Desducans called it, without any wish to be humorous, the Holy Member. He knew, of course, that a merely cartilaginous object could not possibly survive so long. There are at least 16 other holy members in Europe, mostly from mummies, and all equally discredited. But for Deducamp it was simply a collectible, and the religious or indeed human blasphemy it represented had no significance for him. This is true of all collecting. It extinguishes the moral instinct. The object finally possesses the possessor. We never discussed religion or politics. He went to Mass, but only, I think, because the observance of ritual is a form of the cultivation of beauty. In some ways, perhaps because of the wealth that had always surrounded him, he was an extremely innocent man. Self-denial was incomprehensible to him, unless it formed part of some aesthetic regimen. I stood with him once and watched a line of peasants laboring a turnip field. A millet brought to life, and his only remark was, "It is beautiful that they are they and that we are we." For him, even the most painful social confrontations and contrasts, which would have pricked the conscience of even the vulgarest nouveau riche, were stingless, without significance except as vignettes, as interesting discords, as pleasurable because vivid examples of the algedonic polarity of existence. Altruistic behavior, what he termed le diable en puritain, upset him deeply. For instance, since the age of 18, I have refused to eat wild birds in any form at table. I would as soon eat human flesh as I would an ortolan or a wild duck. This, to Deducamp, was distressing, like a false note in a music manuscript. He could not believe things that had been written thus, and yet there I was, in black and white, refusing his pâté d'alouette and his truffled woodcock. But not all his life was to do with the dead. He had an observatory on the roof of his chateau, and a well-equipped biological laboratory. He never walked out in the park without carrying a small étui of test tubes to catch spiders. I had known him over a year before I discovered that this was more than another eccentricity, that he was, in fact, one of the most learned amateur arachnologists of his day. There is even a species named after him, Pteridion de Concy. He was delighted that I also knew something of ornithology, and he encouraged me to specialize in what he jokingly called ornithosemantics, the meaning of bird sound. He was the most abnormal man I had ever met, and the politest, and the most distant, and certainly the most socially irresponsible. I was 25, your age, Nicholas, which will perhaps tell you more than anything I can say how unable I was to judge him. It is, I think, the most difficult and irritating age of all, both to be and to behold. One has the intelligence, one is in all ways treated as a grown man, but certain persons reduce me to adolescence, because only experience can understand and assimilate them. In fact, Deducamp, by being as he was, certainly not by arguing, raised profound doubts in my philosophy, doubts he was later to crystallize for me. So I will tell you in 5 simple words. I saw the faults in his way of life, and at the same time found myself enchanted, that is, unable to act rationally. I have forgotten to tell you that he had manuscript after manuscript of unpublished music of the 17th and 18th centuries. To sit at one of the magnificent old harpsichords in his musicarium, a long rococo gallery in faded gold at Pomona Green, always in sunlight, as tranquil as an orchard, such experiences, such happiness, always give rise to the same problem of the nature of evil. Why should such complete pleasure be evil? Why did I believe that Deducamp was evil? You will say, because children were starving while you played in your sunlight? But are we never to have palaces, never to have refined tastes, complex pleasures, never to let the imagination fulfill itself? Even a Marxist world must have some destination, must develop into some higher state, which can only mean a higher pleasure and richer happiness for the human beings in it. And so I began to comprehend the selfishness of this solitary man. More and more I came to see that his blindness was a pose, and yet his pose was an innocence, that he was a man from a perfect world, lost in a very imperfect one, and determined, with a monomania as tragic, if not quite so ludicrous, as Don Quixote's, to maintain his perfection. But then, one day, Conchis never finished his sentence. With an electrifying suddenness, a horn clambered out of the darkness to the east. I thought immediately of an English hunting horn, but it was harsher, more archaic. Lily's previously wafting fan was frozen, her eyes on Conchis. He was staring out to sea, as if the sound had turned him to stone. As I watched, his eyes closed, almost as if he was silently praying. But prayer was totally foreign to his face. The horn broke the tense night again. 3 notes, the middle the highest. They echoed faintly from some steep hillside inland, the primitive timbre seeming to wake the landscape and the night, to summon from an evolutionary sleep. I said to Lily, "What is it?" She held my eyes for a moment with a strange hint of doubt, as if she half suspected me of knowing perfectly well what it was. "Apollo." "Apollo." Again the horn was blown, but at a higher pitch, and close. Too close to the house now for me to see anything, because of the parapet, even if it had not been night. Conchis still sat with his oblivious face. Lily stood and held out a hand. "Come." I let her lead me to where we had stood before, at the eastern end of the terrace. She stared down into the trees, and I glanced at her profile. Someone seems to be mixing metaphors. She couldn't quite press the smile out of her mouth. My hand was gently squeezed. "Be good. Watch." The gravel, the clearing, the trees, I could see nothing unusual. "I just wish I had a program, that's all." "How very dull of you, Mr. Orff." "Nicholas, please." But whatever answer she might have given to that was forestalled. From somewhere between the house and Maria's cottage there came a beam of light. It was not very strong, from a small electric torch. In it, some 60 yards away on the edge of the pines, a figure stood like a marble statue. With a new shock I realized that it was that of an absolutely naked man. He was just near enough for me to make out the black pubic hair, the pale scape of his penis, tall, well-built, well-cast to be Apollo. His eyes seemed exaggeratedly large, as if they had been made up. On his head there was a glint of gold, a crown of leaves, laurel leaves. He was facing us, immobile, with his yard-long horn, a narrow crescent with a flared end, held slightly out from his waist in his right hand. It struck me after a few seconds that his skin was an unnatural white, almost phosphorescent in the weak beam, as if his body as well as his face had been painted. I looked back. Conchis still sat as before, then at Lily, who watched the figure without expression, yet with a kind of intentness, as if she had seen this rehearsed, and was now curious to see the full performance, that silenced any desire in me to be facetious. The charade itself shocked me less than the revelation that I was not the only young male at Barani. I knew that at once. "Who is he?" "My brother." "I thought you were meant to be an only child." The Apollo figure raised his horn sideways and blew a different note, sustained, yet more urgent, as if calling lost hounds. Lily said slowly, without taking her eyes from him, That is in the other world. And then, before I could challenge her further, she pointed to our left, beyond the cottage. A faint light shape came running out of the dark tunnel where the track to the house emerged from the trees. The torch beam moved to her. It was a girl, and she too was naked, except for antique sandals that were laced up her calves. Or perhaps not quite naked. Either the pubic hair had been shaved, or she wore some kind of cache-sexe. Her hair was bound back in a classical style, and, as with the Apollo, her body and face seemed unnaturally white. She was running too quickly for me to see her features. She threw a look back as she came toward us. She was being chased. She ran toward the sea, between the Apollo and the two of us standing on the terrace. Then a third figure appeared behind her, another man, running out of the trees and down the track. He was got up as a satyr, in some kind of puffed-out, hairy tights, goat haunches, and he had the traditional head, a beard, two stubby horns. His naked torso was dark, almost black. As he ran closer, gaining on the girl, I had my next shock. A huge phallus rose from his loins. It was nearly 18 inches long, far too massive to be meant realistically, but it was effectively obscene. I suddenly remembered the painting in the bowl of the kylix in the room below us, and also remembered I was a long way from home. I felt unsure, out of my depth, a lot more innocent and unsophisticated at heart than I liked to pretend. I did a quick look at the girl beside me. I thought I detected a faint smile, a kind of excitement at cruelty, even when being mimed, that I did not like. It was very remote from the Edwardian other world whose clothes she still wore. I looked back at the nymph, at her white back and disheveled hair, her seemingly near-exhausted legs. She plunged into the trees going down toward the sea and disappeared. And then, in a coup de théâtre, a much stronger beam shone out from directly beneath where we stood. Standing there in the place where the first girl had just disappeared, a place where the ground rose a little before falling abruptly toward the beach, was yet another, the most striking figure of all, a woman in a long saffron chiton. It had a blood-red hem where it ended at the knees. On her feet were black buskins with silver greaves, which gave her a grim gladiatorial look, a strange contrast to the bare shoulders and arms. Again, the skin was unnaturally white, the eyes elongated by black makeup, and the hair was also elongated backwards in a way that was classical, yet sinister. Over her shoulders she had a silver quiver, and in her left hand a silver bow. Something in her stance, as well as her distorted face, was genuinely frightening. She stood there for several moments, cold and outraged, and ominously barring the way. Then she reached back with her free hand, and with a venomous quickness pulled an arrow out of the quiver. But before she could fit it to the bowstring, the beam tracked back to the arrested satyr. He stood spectacularly terrified, his arms flung back and his head averted. The mock phallus, in the better light, I could see it was jet black, still erect. It was a pose without realism, yet dramatic. The beam swept back to the goddess. She had her bow at full stretch. The arrow went. I saw it fly, but lost it in the darkness. A moment later, the beam returned to the satyr. He was clutching the arrow, or an arrow, to his heart. He fell slowly to his knees, swayed a second, then slumped sideways among the stones and thyme bushes. The stronger torch lingered on him, as if to impress the fact of his death. Then it was extinguished. Beyond, in the weaker original beam, Apollo stood impassively, surveying, a pale marmoreal shadow, like some divine umpire, president of the arena. The goddess began to walk, a striding huntress walk, her silver bow held in one hand by her side toward him. They stood facing us for a moment, then each raised a free hand, the palm bent back, in a kind of final tableau, a grave salutation. It was another effective gesture. It had a fleeting but genuine dignity, the farewell of immortals. But then the remaining light went out. I could still just distinguish the two pale shadows, turning away now with the rather mundane haste of actors eager to get off stage while the lights are down. Lily moved as if to distract me from this more pedestrian side of things. "Excuse me one moment." She crossed toward where Conchi sat. I saw her bend over and whisper something. Then I looked back to the east. A dark shape moved toward the trees, the satyr. There was a tiny sound from the colonnade below. Someone had accidentally bumped into a chair and made its legs scrape. 4 other actors, 2 people doing the lighting, the mechanics of the mounting of this and the other incidents began to seem quite as uncanny as truly supernatural happenings. I tried to imagine what connection there was between the elderly man on the road by the hotel, the pre-haunting, and this scene I had just witnessed. I thought I had grasped, during Conchi's telling, the point of the caractère of Desducamps. He had been talking of himself and me. The parallels were too close for it to mean anything else, and discouraged every kind of question. How unable I was to judge him. Very few friends and no relations. But where did that tie in with this latest episode? Plainly, it was an attempt at the sort of scandalous evocation mentioned in Le Masque Français. At that level, I could laugh at it, and at any attempt to resurrect the psychic nonsense. But more and more, I smelt some nasty drift in Conchi's divertimenti. That phallus, the nakedness, the naked girl. I had an idea that sooner or later I was going to be asked to perform as well. Then this was some initiation to a much darker adventure that I was prepared for. A society, a cult, I didn't know what, where Miranda was nothing, and Caliban reigned. I also felt irrationally jealous of all those other people who had appeared from nowhere to poach in my territory, who were in some way in conspiracy against me, who knew more. I could try to be content as a spectator, to let these increasingly weird incidents flow past me as one sits in the cinema and lets the film flow past. But even as I thought that, I knew it was a bad analogy. People don't build cinemas for an audience of one, unless they mean to use that one for a very special purpose. At last, Lily straightened from where she had stood bent beside Conchi's, talking in a low voice to him. She came back toward me. There was a little sliver of knowingness in her eyes now, and unthinkable curiosity to see how I had reacted to this latest development. I smiled and made a little movement of the head. I was impressed, but not fooled, and I was very careful to show her that I was not shocked either. She smiled. "I must go now, Mr. Orff." "Congratulate your friends on their performance." She pretended to be taken aback, and her eyelids fluttered as if she knew she was being teased. "You surely did not suppose they were merely performing?" I said gently, "Come off it." But I received no answer. Her eyes had the tiniest trace of a smile, and then she very delicately bit her lips, before touching her skirt and dropping me the ghost of a curtsy. "When shall I see you again?" Her eyes flicked back toward Conchi's, though her head did not move. Once again I was to believe we were in collusion together. "That depends on when I am next woken from my immemorial sleep. I hope it's very soon." She raised her fan to her lips, just as she had with the recorder brush, and pointed surreptitiously back to Conchi's. I watched her disappear into the house, then I went and stood across the table from him. He seemed recovered from his trance. His eyes were even more intense than usual, like black phosphorus, almost leech-like, much more the eyes of a scientist checking the result of an experiment, the state of the guinea pig, than of a host seeking approval from a guest after a spectacular entertainment. I knew he knew I was confused, even though I looked down at him from behind my chair with the same small skeptical smile I had tried on Lily. Somehow, I also knew that he no longer expected me to believe what I was supposed to believe. I sat down, and still he stared, and I had to say something. I'd enjoy it all more if I knew what it meant. That pleased him. He sat back and smiled. My dear Nicholas, man has been saying what you have just said for the last 10,000 years, and the one common feature of all the gods he has said it to is that not one of them has ever returned an answer. Gods don't exist to answer. You do. I am not going to venture where even the gods are powerless. You must not think I know every answer. I do not. I stared at the now bland mask of his face, then said quietly, Why me? Why anyone? Why anything? I pointed to the east behind him. All that just to give me a lesson in theology? He pointed up to the sky. I think we would both agree that any god who created all that just to give us a lesson in theology was gravely lacking in both humor and imagination. He left a pause. You were perfectly free to return to your school if you wish. Perhaps it would be wiser. I smiled and shook my head. This time I take the tooth. This time it may be real. At least I'm beginning to realize that all your dice are loaded. Then you cannot possibly win. But he went on quickly, as if he had taken a step too far. I will tell you one thing. There is only one answer to your question, both in general terms and in those of your presence here. I gave it to you on your first visit. Why everything is, including you, including me, and all the gods, is a matter of hazard, nothing else, pure hazard. I searched his eyes and at last found something in them that I could believe, and grasped dimly, somewhere, that my ignorance, my nature, my vices and virtues were somehow necessary in his mask. He stood and fetched the brandy bottle from beside the lamp on the other table. He poured me a glass, then a little in his own, and still standing, raised it to me. Let us both drink to knowing each other better, Nicholas. I'll second that. I drank, then gave him a cautious smile. You didn't finish your story. Strangely, that seemed to set him back, as if he had forgotten or presumed I would have no further interest in it. He hesitated, then he sat again. Very well. I was going, but no matter now. He paused. Let us jump to the climax, to the moment when these gods that neither of us believes in lost patience with such hubris. He leant back, once more turned a little to the sea. Whenever I see a photograph of a teeming horde of Chinese peasants, or of some military procession, whenever I see a cheap newspaper crammed with advertisements for mass-produced rubbish, or the rubbish itself that large stores sell, whenever I see the horrors of the Pax Americana, of civilizations condemned to century after century of mediocrity because of overpopulation and under-education, I see also déduquant. Whenever I see lack of space and lack of grace, I think of him. One day, many millennia from now, there will perhaps be a world in which there are only such chateaus, or their equivalents, and such men and women. And instead of their having to grow, like mushrooms, from a putrescent compost of inequality and exploitation, they will come from an evolution as controlled and ordered as Déducant's tiny world at Givray-le-Duc. Apollo will reign again, and Dionysus will return to the shadows from which he came. Was that it? I saw the Apollo scene in a different light. Conchis was evidently like certain modern poets. He tried to kill 10 meanings with one symbol. One day, one of his servants introduced a girl into the chateau. Deducant heard a woman laughing. I do not know how. Perhaps an open window. Perhaps she was a little drunk. He sent to find out who had dared to bring a real mistress into his world. It was one of the chauffeurs, a man of the machine age. He was dismissed. Soon afterward, Deducant went to Italy on a visit. One night at Givray-le-Duc, the major domo smelt smoke. He went to look. The whole of one wing and the center portion of the chateau were on fire. In their master's absence, most of the servants were away at their homes in the neighboring villages. The few who were sleeping at the chateau started to carry buckets of water to the massive flames. An attempt was made to telephone for the pompiers, but the line had been cut. When they finally arrived, it was too late. Every painting was shriveled, every book ashes, every piece of porcelain twisted and smashed, every coin melted, every exquisite instrument, every piece of furniture, each automaton, even Mirabelle, charred to nothingness. All that was left were parts of the walls and the eternally irreparable. I was also abroad at this time. Deducant was woken somewhere near dawn in his hotel in Florence and told. He went home at once, but they say he turned back before he got to the still smoldering remains. As soon as he was near enough to realize what the fire had done. 2 days later he was found dead in his bedroom in Paris. He had taken an enormous quantity of drugs. His valet told me that he was found with a kind of sneer on his face. It had shocked the man. I returned to France a month after his funeral. My mother was in South America, and I did not hear what had happened till my return. One day I was asked to go and see his lawyers. I thought he might have left me a harpsichord. So he had. Indeed, all his surviving harpsichords, and also, but perhaps you have guessed. He paused as if to let me guess, but I said nothing. By no means all his fortune, but what was, in those days, to a young man still dependent on his mother, a fortune. At first I could not believe it. I knew that he liked me, that he had come perhaps to look on me rather as an uncle, a nephew, but so much money, and so much hazard, because I played one day with opened windows, because a peasant girl laughed too loud. Conchis sat in silence for a moment or two. But I promised to tell you the words Deducant also left me, with his money and his memory. No message, but one fragment of a Latin. I have never been able to trace its source. It sounds Greek, Ionian, or Alexandrian. It was this: Utram bibis, aquam an undam. Which are you drinking, the water or the wave? He drank the wave? We all drink both. But he meant the question should always be asked. It is not a precept, but a mirror. I could not decide which I was drinking. What happened to the man who set fire to the house? The law had its revenge. And you went on living in Paris? I still have his apartment, and the instruments he kept there are now in my own chateau in the Auvergne. Did you discover where his money came from? He had large estates in Belgium, investments in France and Germany, but the great bulk of his money was in various enterprises in the Congo. Givray-le-Duc, like the Parthenon, was built on a heart of darkness. Is Burani built on it? Would you leave at once if I said it was? No. Then you have no right to ask. He smiled. I was not to take him too seriously, and stood up, as if to kill any further argument. Take your envelope. He led the way through to my room, and lit my lamp, and wished me good night. but in his own door he turned and looked back toward me. For once his face showed a moment's doubt, a glimpse of a lasting uncertainty. The water or the wave? Then he went.